And I'd like to introduce the first tutorial speaker today, who's one of the two co-organizers of the workshop. So Lei Ying is a professor in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department at the University of Michigan. So broadly speaking, Lei works on problems at the intersection of stochastic networks and big data, including machine learning. He has co-authored multiple books. In particular, one book called Diffusion Source Localization in Large Networks is closely related to the topic of his tutorial today. And interestingly, the topic is one that was started by the other co-organizer, Devavrat Shah and Tauhid Zaman from Yale, who will be one of the speakers of this workshop. So Lei is quite incredible. He works on a large number of topics, and surprisingly, whatever he works on, his work gets recognized. He has won awards, best paper awards, and other kinds of honors from multiple different organizations, including IEEE Infocom, ACM Sigmetrics, YOPT, and KDB. So without further ado, I'll turn the virtual stage over to Lei. Lei, please share your screen and you can start your tutorial.
Okay, so first I would like to thank Srikant for the very kind introduction. Also, I would like to thank Shankar and Srikant for inviting Devavrat and me to organize this very exciting workshop. I'm also very glad to be the first speaker because you can expect more exciting talks after this, okay? So this tutorial is about inverse problem in combating epidemics and fake news. So I guess I don't have to say too much about the devastating impact of epidemics and fake news. So the reason we are here today virtually instead of meeting each other in person is because the COVID-19 pandemic, right? But this is just a very, very minor aspect of this horrible pandemic. We know across the world, the deaths is approaching 1 million. And for US, the GDP fell more than 30% in the second quarter. And the same thing can be said for misinformation or fake news. So I guess we all know the tremendous damage has been done in 2016 due to fake news. But even before that, there's lots of stories about fake news causing lots of damage. For example, in 2013, a tweet from hacked Associated Press account, Twitter account, saying there are 2 explosions in the White House and then President Obama was injured. That single fake news set the Dow Jones down 150 points, which equivalent to $136 billion in value. Okay. And today, the things has become even worse because we have this pandemic and we have these fake news, they are fueling each other. So here is just an example which I pick from this recent report about fake news related to COVID-19, okay? These are examples saying there's a fake news about consuming highly concentrated alcohol can disinfect the body and kill the virus. That single fake news has led to 800 deaths and close to 6,000 hospitalization. That's just horrible, okay? So therefore, I think it's very important for us as academia, as the researchers, and also as a society to get together to develop ways to combat epidemics and fake news. So this is a multifaceted problem involve, I think, many different disciplines, like we need to develop fast, accurate testing algorithms, and we need to develop effective vaccines and therapeutics, right? And also we need to able to mine the text of the fake news or the Twitters or the messages to find out which one is likely to be fake, and algorithm to detect bots, trolls, and spammers. And also as a major focus of this workshop, we need to understand the dynamics of spreading fake news, dynamics of epidemics in networks, and also how the opinions are formulated and so on, okay? So there's already a tremendous interest and investment related to this problem. For example, the center led by Srikant and Shankar has funded 26 research proposals which covered lots of these areas and topics. And also as a self-promotion, our workshop is focused on lots of these problems. The main focus is on opinion epidemic dynamics in networks, but there are also speakers cover other topics, including therapy intervention mechanism, mitigation mechanism, and also how to detect the fake news quickly and how to identify bots on the network and so on. So please look for the exciting talks in these 4 days. Okay. So for this tutorial, I'm gonna take a unified but very narrow view about epidemics and fake news. So I think as Srikant mentioned, this workshop focusing on opinions, epidemics, and fake news. So these are the different things physically across different disciplines. But on the other hand, if you look at the fundamental mathematical model, we can unify them with a narrow view such that they are all diffusions in networks, right? As the picture showed here. So we will have a network, then some information spreading in the network. There could be virus or it could be like misinformation. So what are the inverse problems here? So the inverse problem means if we are given some observation, like we give a network, we know in a network, some nodes are already infected or some nodes are spreading the fake news. So with this information, can we go back and find out, for example, which node is the source or the origin of the epidemic or the fake news? And if we have some additional information or some like partial time step and other side information, can we use that to reconstruct the entire spreading history, tell us how the information is spreading, how the pandemic spreads from the origin to other place, and so on. And furthermore, there are the questions like if we observe some widespread of infection, then is that infection come from random infection or infection through particular mean, right? Can we go back and figure it out? So there's many interesting problems related to inverse problem in combating epidemics and fake news. So in this tutorial, although the title is inverse problems, but I figured instead of like scratch face of multiple problems, I'll rather focusing on just one and talk about interesting result related to that single problem, which is source localization in networks. Okay. As Srikant mentioned, this work actually started from the co-organizer, Darrett, and his student Tawhid Zaman, who now is a professor at Yale. And their paper in 2010 basically proposed this source localization problem as a stochastic network problem, and that led to many interesting works on this topic. Okay. So I like the problem a lot because this is one of the problems which you can describe very easily, just use a few lines, but it takes like pages of analysis to get some interesting result, okay? So what is a source localization problem? So here is a single line statement about source localization. Basically, that means you have an observation, like say you have a network. And in this network, you notice, so you notice like there are some nodes, a subset of nodes are infected. These are the nodes in red, and some other nodes which are not infected. So let's say you have this single snapshot and you observe the states of those nodes, whether they're infected or not, but you don't have any other information, for example, time step. Then can you use this observation to figure out where the spreading comes from? Who is the nodes? Which node is the first one which spread that information, right? So that's the problem definition. So as I mentioned, there have been lots of works on that, but by large, there are two major source localization, source estimators. One is called Rumor Center, which was developed by Shah and Zaman back in 2010 in that paper, I think the first paper on this topic. And that mainly for continuous time diffusion models. And the other major source estimator is the Jordan Infection Center that are for discrete time diffusion models, which used by me and my student back in 2012. Okay, so in this tutorial, I'll focus on these two main source estimators, rumor center, and the Jordan infection center. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is a rumor center. I guess it's a good time maybe for me to stop, or maybe for 1 minute to see there any question.
So Lei, I don't know if everybody would be familiar with the terminology. So maybe you use the term inverse problem. So what is the direct problem and what is the inverse? Maybe you can mention why you call these inverse problems.
Okay, yeah, very good question, Srikant, thanks. So I call it inverse problem because related to the inverse problem, there are also forward problem. So if we think about epidemics and fake news spreading, right? So inverse problem means we go back the history, try to figure out what happened in the past. Like if we have observation, then we try to go back to figure out where it started from and how the information spread and lead to the observation we have. And there are also forward problem, like if we see some observation, see some spreading in the network, then whether that information will become viral or not, that's called forward problem. You try to look at in the future what will happen. And also, for example, from the history you observe, you try to detect whether it's a fake news or not fake news quickly and when actively getting more information. So that, in my view, can also be called forward problems. So forward means like you're going to the future, try to predict what will happen in the future. And the inverse problem I talk about is like backward problem. You try to go back to history to figure out what happened in the past.
So Tamer Bashar has a great question. So what if there are multiple sources and not a single one?
Yeah, so there's a result related to that. I think for both the rumor center and for the Jordan infection center, there will be result extend a single source to multiple source. There already works on that. But in this tutorial, I'm just focusing on the single source problem. But they're already result of dealing with multiple source. And also for multiple source, there's two different versions. The easy version is all the information start at multiple places at the same time. But also there are scenarios where you can start the spreading at multiple locations at different times. That turns out to be a more challenging problem.
So will you provide us references or provide the audience references at some point for the multiple source infection problem? Or
right, there's some reference I mentioned in the earlier slides. I think this include multiple sources as well.
Okay. Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I can double check on that, make sure I provide complete reference on that as well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Rika. Okay, so I guess if there are no further questions, I will first focus on Davert and the man's work called the Rumor Center. Okay, it's a really interesting work. Actually, I want to mention also these are 2010 paper by Davert and Tawhid was selected as this year's Sigmatrix Test Time Award. So that says quality of this work. Okay. So as mentioned, the Rumor Center is a source estimator for continuous time diffusion model. So let me define what is a continuous time diffusion model, look at in their paper. So they look at this very classic susceptible infection diffusion model. That's a very classic epidemic model. So where each node will have two states, either it's infected or susceptible. Then the infection starts from the center node. And then for each edge of the center node, we will have a 3 exponential clock. And when the exponential clock ticks, that infection, that the virus will spread over that clock that ticks, right? So here, this node ticks, then the infection, then you get a new infected node. So now you have 4 edges, which will have this exponential clock, and the clock ticks means the information will spread or the disease will spread over that edge, and you have more infected node and so on. Okay, so this is a continuous time model because you have this exponential clock determines how the infection spreads in the network. Okay, so again, let's go back to the source localization problem. Is we have a single snapshot, and in this snapshot, we know there are a subset of nodes are infected, other nodes are in the susceptible state. And we want to know which one is more likely, the most likely to be the source node. Okay, So this problem you can see can be formulated as a maximum likelihood problem, where given each node, conditioned on, let's say, node A is a source, what's the probability to get to the observation we have? Or you can look at if given node B as a source, what's the probability to get the observation we have? Okay, so that's a kind of maximum likelihood formulation. Okay, conditioned on a node, what's the probability to be a source? We want to find the node which is most likely to lead to the observation we have. Okay, so our key result in related to the rumor center is if we consider our regular tree network. So on a regular tree, each node have same degree. Okay, then the result says the maximum likelihood estimator is the rumor center. Okay. And the rumor center is a node with the maximum rumor centrality. Okay, so if you think about this, it's a very amazing result because what you have is a network and you have lots of nodes infected. And the result says independent of how many nodes are infected and so on, the maximum likelihood estimator is always the node called the rumor center. Okay, so it's like you are looking a needle in a haystack, but this specific node, which called rumor center, is always most likely to be the source node. Okay, a very, very strong theoretical result. Okay, so now to understand this result, we need to understand what is the rumor center, right? Well, why we call the node as a rumor center. And according to the definition, the rumor center is defined based on a centrality measure called rumor centrality. So we need to understand what is rumor centrality. And the rumor centrality actually is defined by something called a permitted permutation. Okay, so let me start from permitted permutation, and then we will talk about rumor centrality and rumor centers. So what is a permitted permutation? Permitted permutation basically is a feasible infection sequence. Okay, so on the left-hand side is just an example with 6 nodes. All these 6 nodes are infected. Okay. So remember, the observation we have does not include any time step, right? So permitted permutation, basically the sequence of nodes such that if you follow that sequence, you'll get the observation you have. So let's say we look at the first permitted permutation, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that you can see happens if we have node 1 as a source, that infect node 2, then 2 infect 3, 2 infect 4, 1 infect 5, 1 infect 6. So that is permitted, which means you can have this infection follow this order such that you can get to the subnetwork you have. Okay. So now if we look at a different infection sequence, let's say it's 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, 6, then you realize that this is not feasible because to infect node 3, you have to infect node 2 first. So 2 has to be infected before node 3 if 1 is a source. So this permutation is not permittable. Okay, so therefore our permitted permutation basically tells you the sequence of infection that is feasible based on the observation you have. So rumor centrality basically is defined to be the number of permitted permutation associated with each node. So if I pick node 1 as my root node, as my first node in the permutation, then how many permitted permutation I'll have? And if I pick node 2 as my root node of all permitted permutation, then how many permitted permutation will be there associated with node 2? Right? So for each node, we can define this rumor centrality. The rumor center basically is a node which has a maximum rumor centrality. In other words, the rumor center is the one which leads to the maximum number of permitted permutations as a root node. Okay, so why this result holds, like why we have this very clean, nice result is based on the following claim. The claim is if we look at this regular tree and look at this SI model, then all permitted permutation occurs with the same probability on our regular graph. So remember, if we look at the maximum likelihood problem, right? What we need to calculate is the probability. What's the probability? Node A is a source, so we get the observation, and node B is a source, we get the observation, and so on. Okay, so these are all probability calculations. But when we look at this result related to rumor center, then it's not a probability argument, it's a counting result. It says, I don't need to worry about the probability, I just need to look at how many permitted permutations we have. So make our probability problem to be a counting problem. The reason why this result holds is because this nice result, it says all the permitted permutation occurs with the same probability on a regular tree. Okay, so let's see why this result holds. Is because the following two intuition. The first of all, it says the boundary nodes are equally likely to be next infected nodes. So the boundary nodes here are the nodes I highlighted in blue. Okay, so these are the nodes which are susceptible but are connected to the infected node. So they are all candidates of becoming the next infected node. So we know if we assume the exponential clocks are the same, are homogeneous, then it only depends on which clock will click first, right? So therefore, all these boundary nodes, candidate nodes, are equally likely to be the next infected node. So that's the first observation we can have. And the second observation is if we look at number of boundary nodes we can have, that number actually only depends on the number of infected nodes we already have in our graph, not depends on the particular structure of how these infected nodes are connected. The reason is this is a regular tree. So when you add an infected node, you basically, let's say the degree is D, then you increase the number of boundary nodes by D minus 2, right? Because you already have one infected, that the parent node is already infected, that takes out 1. And yourself become infected, you take out 2. And then you introduce another, you introduce another D minus 1. You introduce another D minus 1 boundary nodes, but yourself become infected. So then you add D minus 2 boundary nodes into this graph. Okay, so because it's a regular tree, so therefore the number of boundary nodes are only determined only by the number of infected nodes, not by the structure of how these infected nodes are connected. Okay, so therefore, if you look at the permuted permutations, you can see this is a random process. The rate the next infected node appears will depends on how many infected nodes you already in your permutation, but not like the sequence they appears, only depend on that number. So that sequence will uniquely determine like with 1 node infected, 2 node infected, 3 node infected, that determine your stochastic process, right? And how fast that permitted permutation can grow. Okay, so because of that, we only need to know the number of infected nodes already have in the sequence. So therefore, if you look at all the permutation sequence, they will have the same property, and therefore they occur with the same probability. Okay, so therefore we don't need to worry about the individual probability of each permuted or permitted permutation. Just need to worry about for given node how many permitted permutations are there. Okay, so that's a very nice result. That leads to the conclusion that on a regular tree, the maximum likelihood estimator is a rumor center. Okay, so I think I will pause here for maybe 1 minute, and then I talk about how to generalize that to general trees and general graph as a heuristic.
So there is a question from Samir Kular. I guess, yeah, I think I shouldn't have read Tamer Bishar's question. I think I should let the audience unmute themselves and ask the question. I think that'll be more interactive. Samir, are you still there? Then you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
No, that's okay. I actually typed a question before he went into the timing issue. So I was sort of wondering, in most, when you make an observation, you know a little bit more about beyond just the state, you kind of might know A was infected before B, and how does that play a role? That's sort of what I was thinking when you started the talk.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, I think the first few papers on rumor, source localization, we focus on this scenario. There's no time step. There are later follow-up works, including some works from my group, where we do look at if you have partial time steps, like as you said, not only just the state of the node, but at what time the node has been infected. and how to use that to improve the accuracy of source localization. And another thing you mentioned, I think is also a very good point, is even sometimes we don't have information about the time step, but we may know who infected who, right? So the direction of the infection, that also actually very helpful for source localization. So I think from algorithm perspective, all these information are very helpful. Open question, I think I also mentioned at the end, is what's the fundamental limit there, right? How much time step you need to know to get like a certain accuracy, and what additional information can help you in terms of fundamentally improve the accuracy of source localization. I think from theory perspective, these are all like wide open questions.
So I have a question, which is what happens? So here you're assuming all the data is available, so there's no missing data for a regular tree. Do you need? I guess there is no missing data here. Is that assumption?
Yeah. So for this one is the assumption that you have a complete snapshot. There's a follow-up work which deal with partial observation as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let me continue. So here, again, the result that the rumor center is the maximum likelihood estimator is based on the assumption the network is a regular tree. But this concept can be extended to general trees and graphs. That means the estimator remain to be the maximum likelihood estimator, but in Davert and Tokay's work, they are shown that is actually work very effectively in these realistic scenarios. So the idea is, first the challenge of extending this result to general trees or general graph is now we need to consider the probability associated with the different permitted permutation. Because if it's not a regular tree, then the two observations I made in the previous slide do not hold. So therefore, to find the maximum likelihood estimator, we do need to calculate the probability. But we know this is impossible given the exponential number of permitted permutation you can have in the graph, right? A key observation made in their work is although on general tree or general graph, these different permitted permutation occurs with different probabilities, but if we fix a root node, let's say we consider node A, just arbitrary node A, then the permitted permutation starting from that node A will roughly have same probability. So as a heuristic, we can look at the following approximation. So if we are interested in calculating what's the probability of getting observation O with node V as a source, then we can pick a typical permutation, just pick one. One good candidate is to use the breadth tree and calculate the probability of that permutation on that breadth tree. So we calculate the probability for a specific permitted permutation, then count how many number of permitted permutation we have, and look at the product of the two as a measure of how likely node V is a source. Okay, so here is just an example. Okay, so we have these 9 node network, and 5 of them are infected, 4 of them are susceptible. Okay, so now let's first start from node A. Let's say I want to know what's the likelihood node A is a source, right? So in this case, I have node A connect to B, C, D, E. These are all infected nodes. And each of these infected nodes, B, C, D, E, has another susceptible node connect to them, okay? So now I can pick a particular permutation, A, B, C, D, E. You know, since B, C, D, E all connect to node A, so therefore, as long as A is the first node, any other permutation among B, C, D, E will be equally likely, right? So therefore, the probability have this specific permutation A, B, C, D, E is 1/4 raised to the power 4, because each position you can choose from one of them, so it's 1/4 of power 4. Sorry. That's wrong. Okay. So what happens is for node A, when you pick next node, you have 4 candidates to choose, B, C, D, E. So now let's say if you pick B, then the next candidate is among the node connect to B and the CDE. So again, you have 4 candidates. So you pick one of pick C from them that occurs with probability 1/4. So now if B, C are already infected, so then the next candidate will be the 2 susceptible nodes connect to B and C, then DE. Again, you pick 1 from 4. So therefore, to get a specific sequence permutation here, the probability is 1/4 raised to the power 4. Okay. And if we look at how many permitted permutations I have, that's actually, I mentioned earlier, BCD can be in arbitrary order. So therefore you have 4 factorial number of permitted permutations starting from node A, okay? So now if we select node B as our source node, then our node A has to be the next one because otherwise you cannot infect CDE, okay? So node A is one of the 2 offsprings of node B. So therefore that node A is selected with the probability half. Then for selecting CDE, each of them will be selected with the probability 1/4, similar to the argument I made for the graph in the middle. So therefore this particular permutation occurs with probability half times 1/4 raised to the power of 3. And if we look at how many permitted permutation we have for node B to be the root node, then the number is 3 factorial because B has to be the first node, A has to be the second node, and the CDE can be in arbitrary order. So there are 3 factorials of that. Okay. So now if we look at the product and we find the product rate to node A actually is larger than that of node B. So A is more likely to be the source than node B. And you can repeat that for like other nodes as well and figure out which one is most likely to be the source. Okay, so that's works as a heuristic, but it works pretty well. So as a summary in terms of rumor centers, if we consider this SI continuous time model, then for regular trees, it's a maximum likelihood estimator. And also beyond just saying this is a maximum likelihood estimator, in Stochastic and Darrow's paper, they also characterize the probability of finding the probability of this rumor center is actual source, right? So the result says if the tree is a 2 regular tree, then that probability actually goes to 0 as t goes to infinity. So t is the infection time, is the time you took the snapshot. Okay, so you can see the larger time t is, then more infected nodes you observe. So on a 2 regular tree, that probability actually, the rumor center is the source goes to 0. And if we have 3 regular tree, then the probability is asymptotically 1/4. And if the degree is greater than 3, then that probability can be lower bounded by a constant. So with a constant probability, the rumor center is the actual source. Okay. On general trees, so I didn't mention how to calculate the rumor centrality, right? You can see if the number of permitted permutation actually grows exponentially, right? But Darrow's and Stochastic has an algorithm, a message passing algorithm, which are able to calculate this rumor centrality with ON complexity. Okay. And related to rumor centers, after their work, there's a number of papers which extending this result to multiple directions. I just want to mention that and provide some reference. It's incomplete, but these are the reference related to this topic. So for example, people have looked at the partial observations, also multiple source related to Tamar's question. I think Srikant has a paper showing in a multi-source case under what condition the detection is not possible. Not only the probability goes to 0, and also to find a source from like a little on of nodes is also impossible. It's a very strong impossibility result. And also there's a work dealing with if we have some prior knowledge about the distribution of the source. We know like from our experience, maybe there's maybe a subset of nodes are more likely to be source than the others, and how to utilize this information. And also if we have multiple infection instances, not just a single snapshot, maybe have multiple snapshots, and how to aggregate this information. together and to do a better source localization. And also there's result on random graphs by Shaw and the man as well. Okay, so so as a recap, for now the rumor center is what we talk about, and is a very strong estimator. It's guaranteed to be the maximum likely estimator on regular trees and also work well on general graphs. But the assumption we made is that's the diffusion process we are talking about is continuous time diffusion process, right? So question now is if it's not continuous time, if it's discrete time diffusion, what we can say about source localization and what kind of estimator we should use. Okay, so I think it's also a good time to pause a little bit before I go to Jordan Infection Center.
So I noticed that in Devavrat's paper, it said theory and experiments. So are you going to talk about experiments, or what kind of data set can you use to verify this kind of modeling?
Yeah, so in Darrell's paper, including both experiments, I think this tutorial I actually made that more towards the theory side. I think like my personal experience, so we did have some data from Twitter. So there's some labeled data with timestamp, not Twitter, sorry, the Weibo data is like Chinese version of Twitter. So that data set including like the timestamps, many different tweets and the timestamp associated with each tweets. So we are able to use that to verify both the the Jordan Infection Center and also some later algorithm which utilize partial timestamp information to validate that.
So a natural data source would be something like Twitter, or okay, so that's where opinions propagate. So okay.
Yeah, so natural data set will be any data set which including like spreading diffusion on networks with some timestamp information. So you know like the ground truth, which node is the actual source. And you can use that to verify the theory.
Okay, great. So there are two questions. So maybe Aresh Dadlani can unmute and ask the question. Aresh, are you there? Okay, maybe I'll ask the question. So is there any work considering temporal networks where the links change dynamically?
Good question. Not I'm aware of, but I think that's a very good question. Yeah.
Okay. Is Bijet Hebar? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So can you everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what I wanted to know was, I believe you assumed like the edges that connect your graph currently, all of them have equal exponential time for the spreading phenomenon. So I was wondering if like, do you assume different exponential times over each edges? Is that a work that's been done?
Not I'm aware. Maybe Darrell can comment on that. So I know like if we go to the second part of the talk, I have a better answer for that. So for discrete time, the result I can talk about does allow different edge have a different infection time and infection model. But I'm not sure for this rumor center that has been done or not.
Okay, I got it. Because like I would believe like certain social groups, for example, might have faster spreads than other social groups. Like in like a subgraph in the network would have a faster spread.
Right,
So,
right, exactly.
It's something of that sort. It would be interesting to see that captured as well.
Yeah. So I think the issue, for example, if we look at the rumor center on the regular trees, again, if the infection, the clock are different, then you need to consider this difference, and because the probability associated with different permutation will be different.
Yeah, that's right.
That's not directly applicable in that case, but I'm not aware whether other people have done that. Okay, heterogeneous case.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So maybe Devavrat can answer. He has a comment on the data sets, and maybe also he has a comment on Vijay Hebar's question. So maybe Devavrat can unmute and.
Sure. there's one classic data set worth just for the purpose of playing, if not the real experiments, is from 1850s cholera outbreak, where in London there's a cholera outbreak, and then there's a water pump that people identified as the source. So there's a death locations available, and then sort of the location of water pump is in ground truth. That's something is an interesting data set to play with. Another comment related to Vijay's question. So I think if one goes to the generic branching process theory, like Atreya and Ney style, then similar, at least non-trivial detection probabilities can be identified through connections to Malthusian parameters of the branching process and the graph structure. Some of that we tried to characterize in that 2016 paper. But the question I think you had was more precisely, how does it change with network parameters and all that? I think that becomes a little bit more involved, because you're saying that sort of nodes have their own parameters, and that determines branching processes distribution. Then that will be interesting question to analyze.
Thanks, Sivabrad.
Thanks, Darren. Okay, so Srikanth, any other question in the chat?
Oh, you can continue, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now I'm gonna switch gear and moving away from continuous diffusion model to discrete time diffusion model, and let's see what interesting thing we can say from that. Okay, so that result I can present mainly based on the following two papers by me and my student. Okay, so first of all, as I mentioned earlier, if we talk about discrete time diffusion model, then one of the major estimator is called the Jordan infection center. So it's not a new concept. I think everyone knows what is Jordan center is on graph. Basically, the node which can connect all the other nodes with a minimum number of distance, right? So that's kind of the center of the graph. The Jordan infection center is just a variation of this Jordan center. You look at the distance to all the infected nodes. So the Jordan infection center is a node which can reach all the infected nodes with minimum number of hops. So for example, in this example, the node circled in blue is the actual source and also is the Jordan infection center, because it can reach all the infected nodes with 3 hops. And if you look at another node, for example, this node circled in green, then it takes at least 4 hops to cover all the infected nodes. So therefore, Jordan infection center again is a node which can cover all the infected nodes with a minimum number of hops. So it's a very simple concept. On the graph, you can find it very easily. Okay. So as I said, we're going to talk about discrete time diffusion models. Actually, our results, some of these results hold for very general discrete time diffusion models, but let's focus on a simple one for this tutorial's purpose. Let's look at this independent cascade model proposed by Goldenberg, Levi, Muller in 2001. So it's very similar to the SI model, but the one difference is you only have one chance to infect your neighbor. Okay, so it's in this model, each node also has 2 states, susceptible or infected. Then for each edge, you have infection probability Q. And the infected node will try to infect its neighbor with that probability once. If it succeeds, then the neighbor becomes infected. If it's failed, then you're not going to try again. Okay, so that's the independent cascade model. So for example, in this example, all 3 edges are succeeded. So the source node infects 3. And then in the next round, this top node infect another node. So it succeeds on one of the edge, failed on another. Same thing for the newly infected nodes on the left, and the bottom node successfully infect 2 of his neighbors. So this is how the information spread. So it's a time slotted model. At each time slot, the newly infected node will try to infect their neighbors. If succeed, then that neighbor become infected, and then in the next time slot, only newly infected nodes will try to infect their neighbors. Okay. So you can see if we look at this independent cascade model, you can imagine it's equivalent to say have each edge is associated with a biased coin, so instead of exponential clock. And the propagation process basically is a sequentially flipping this bias coin, right? So when you have a newly infected node, you flip the coin associated with this newly infected edge, decide whether the infection should continue from that node or not. Okay, so that make the like this one. So from the source, you flip 4 different coins. Then the one with the head, which is the one connect to the bottom, the nodes at node down. Then that infection spread over that edge. Then for the other 3 different edges, the infection got blocked. Okay. Then that newly infected node again will flip 2 biased coin associated with its edge. Then it probably propagated to the left because that is the head, blocked on the right because it's a tail. Okay. So because this sequential nature of the independent cascade model, it makes the problem kind of tricky because you need to consider all the correlation, the temporal correlation across time. So a very nice equivalent way to look at this process is a live edge graph model proposed by Kempe, Kleinberg, and Tados. And actually, John Kleinberg is also one of our speakers. So please look forward to his talk as well. Okay. So this live edge graph model works as follows. So instead of flipping the coin one by one sequentially, let's just flip all the coins once at the beginning. Okay, so I don't do it according to my diffusion process. Independent of the diffusion process, I flip all my biased coin at the beginning. So I get a bunch of heads and a bunch of tails. And I know the infection will be blocked on all the edges, which give me tail, and which will be succeed on all the edges give me the head, right? So currently I can basically remove all the edges which are associated with the tail, block the edges, and which give me a new graph, which called a live edge graph, okay? So on the live edge graph, if we have a diffusion process, then the diffusion is deterministic because we know as long as at the edge that the infection should succeed, propagate or spread over that edge. Okay. Of course, for each original graph, we'll have many live edge graphs associated with the original one because you have many coin toss and there are many outcomes. Okay. So now if we look at a specific live edge graph, then the decide which nodes are infected is a deterministic result, right? Because I already decide which edges are feasible for infection, which edges are not feasible. So for example, if this is the live edge graph I have, then if I start infection from the middle node and let the infection propagate 2 steps, then I know exactly which 2 nodes should be infected, right? These are the 2 nodes marked in red. Okay, so in general, if we look at diffusion trees with time duration t, that basically is a t-hop neighborhood of the source on some live edge graph. Okay, so that's just a concept. So now, again, I already defined the diffusion, discrete time diffusion process, and the source localization problem is the same, right? So now let's look at this maximum likelihood problem again. It's the same problem. We have observation O, and we want to know which node is most likely to be the source node. Okay. Again, this relate to compare 2 probabilities. What's the probability of getting this observation by starting the diffusion from node A, compare with what's the probability you get this observation starting the diffusion from source B. Okay. So remember, in the rumor center case, we kind of changed the problem. We transfer the problem of calculating the probability to a counting problem of counting the number of permitted permutation. So now the question is, I introduced this live edge graph. Can we also transfer this problem of calculating probabilities to count the number of live edge graphs? Okay, so let's first look at this and then I discuss further. Actually, it's not that straightforward. Yeah, you'll see that later. Okay, so let's see. First is for given node. In the rumor center case, we have permitted permutation associated with each node, right? Then for this discrete time model, IC model, we can define feasible live edge graph for each node. Okay, so what is feasible? Feasible means if I given node A as a source, assume node A is a source, And given that live edge graph, it's possible to get an observation I have. Okay, so I think it's better to use an example to explain that. So let's say this is a live edge graph I have. So I already remove all the dead edges or blocked edges. And this is the observation O I have. So I have 3 infected nodes, A, B, C. Okay. So now let's say if I use node B as my source node, then whether this live edge graph is feasible for that or not, right? So we can check it's feasible. So I can start from my infection from node B and let it propagate for 2 time slot. Then it will infect A, infect C. Okay, so that will give the give the observation I have. So if I look at node A as my source, again, this live edge graph is feasible for node A because I can consider 1 time step infection, then A will infect both B and C. Okay. However, it's not feasible for node C because if C is my source, then to infect A and B, C has to infect these 2 other neighbors as well, which actually are connected on this live edge graph, which means the infection should propagate if I start from C. So C is not actually, this live edge graph actually is not feasible for C. So it's feasible for A and B, but not feasible for C. Okay. So now let's say I already defined for each node, given our live edge graph, we can check whether it's feasible or not. Okay. And here actually are 2 conditions you can use to check whether our live edge graph is feasible for a given node. But let me skip that. The question is now, can we also transfer the problem of calculating probability to a problem of comparing the number of feasible live edge graphs for each node, right? So that would be similar to what we did in the Lumber Center case. However, remember when I talk about the model, I talk about, I didn't mention that, I guess I should mention now. We consider the network as a tree network, but it's a general tree. It's not a regular tree, so it's arbitrary tree, okay? So because it's a general tree, so different live edge graphs actually occurs with different probabilities. So we cannot directly actually use some like counting argument we did in the Lumber Center case because this issue, right? If we want to actually calculate the probability, it's not just the number, it's also individual live edge graphs likelihood is very important. So that's make the problem very difficult. Okay, so let's see how to deal with this issue. It turns out there's a nice way to get around that. So to mention that nice way of getting around that, we need to introduce another concept called infection eccentricity. So it's not a very complex concept, it's fairly easy, okay? So what is infection eccentricity? Basically is a minimal number of hops for a node to reach all infected nodes, right? So if we look at node A here, it takes 1 hop for node A to reach 2 infected nodes. So the eccentricity is 1. And for node B, it takes 2 hops. So the infection eccentricity for node B is 2. And the same thing, the infection eccentricity for node C is 2 as well. Okay, so for each node, for each infect node, we can define this infection eccentricity. So a very nice result, which make the entire problem kind of easy, is the following lemma, which we call the neighboring nodes lemma. So we know if we consider 2 arbitrary nodes, then the live edge graphs associated with these 2 arbitrary nodes could be very different. Okay, so some may be including node A, some may be feasible for node A, not feasible for node B, and vice versa. However, if we consider 2 neighboring nodes, things are very different. This lemma says if I consider a live edge graph which is feasible for node B, it has to be feasible for node A, which is the node B's neighbor, and it has a smaller eccentricity. Okay, so let me pause that because this is probably the most important lemma for this result. And let me repeat it again. If we consider 2 neighboring nodes and A has a smaller eccentricity than B, then our live edge graph, which is feasible for B, had to be feasible for A as well. So in other words, if you consider all the live edge graphs feasible for B, it is a subset of live edge graphs for A. So now we don't need to worry about probability, right? Because all the live edge graphs included feasible for B are automatically feasible for A. So therefore, the probability of having B as a source is upper bounded of the probability of node A as a source. Okay. So in this example, for example, we look at again ABC, 3 nodes. We know this live edge graph is feasible for B and A, not feasible for C. And also from the lemma above, we know as long as it's feasible for B, then automatically it's feasible for A. It's kind of, you can verify that use this simple example. Okay. So based on this lemma and another result called monotonicity result, the monotonicity result says if we have a tree, then pick any node which is not the Jordan infection center, look at the path from that node to the closest Jordan infection center, then it's guaranteed the infection eccentricity will monotonically decrease. So by combining these results together, you can see for any node, I find this path, close that node to the closest Jordan infection center. Then along this path, the infection eccentricity strictly decrease. That means when you move along this path towards the Jordan infection center, the nodes are more and more and more likely to be the source. So therefore, the maximum likelihood estimator must be a Jordan infection center. Okay, so I think this is also a good time to pause and to answer any questions, clarifications.
So Yunshu Zhou has a question. Maybe Yunshu, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, I just want to maybe have an example of the discrete time diffusion processes, because the continuous time makes sense to me. What are some of the real life examples of that a source can only have one chance to infect his or her neighbors?
That's a good question. So I have to admit this independent cascade model is not as realistic as like the SI model. But as I mentioned, I mentioned this IC model mainly for the tutorial purpose. And I'll come on later. Actually, this Jordan infection center is kind of universal, holds for that some of the result holds for the SI model, SIR model, SIRI model, and so on. They're actually a paper on universality of this Jordan center. But yeah, I agree. Like if we just look at the IC model alone, it may not be. But as general as other model, but one model I can think is in terms like information spreading. Maybe it's like you show this information to your neighbor, to a friend, and he or she either believe it or not. Maybe it's a one shot. So completely telling, let's assume the model which continuously telling the story won't change too much about her belief. So that could be maybe modeled as an IC model.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Noah Friedkin. So Noah, can you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, your models strike me as being subject to a set of very strong constraints. And I'm wondering what constraints you think might be realistic to relax in future research. I mean, you're dealing with for example, you're dealing with a very special case of a network topology. You're making assumptions about sequencing. I mean, there's just, unless I'm missing something, you're dealing with a highly specialized case. Is this a jumping point into a program that begins to relax these constraints? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, there's a lots of extension relaxation already based on the like rumor center or Jordan infection center to other directions. But on the other hand, I have to say, like in terms like general topology, general diffusion models, there are still many questions remain to be answered. I'll also comment on at the end of this talk about open questions. But you're absolutely right. Like some of these strong results, like maximum likelihood estimator, has to depend on some specific models and very restricted diffusion models. But again, as I mentioned, I will comment on later, we are towards the direction of generating many of these results. For example, for these tree results, you will see it allows heterogeneous IC model as well, because now I don't care about probability. I have these strong, very strong neighboring node lemma. So even different edges occur, the infection occurs with different probability, the same result will also hold. And next, I will talk about beyond tree. I believe that is one of the first result on general graphs, not very general graph, but on the Arbor random graph. Again, we have very strong theoretical result there. That result actually can be generalized to partial observations, SI models, SIR models as well that holds all in all these scenarios. But I mean, for the beginning, just to illustrate this, talk about this concept, I pick this IC model and tree as a starting point for that.
Madhav Marathe can go next.
Thank you.
Shrikant, thanks. You might have answered it partially. So, in an SIR process, you typically have a recovery time rather than getting one time to infect. So that could be thought of as an SIR process where you recover in 1 unit of time. And that may be the way to think of this as generalization, where instead of 1 unit of time, you take k units of time to recover.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Very good. Yeah, very good comment. Yeah. So I think that I just clarify the maximum likelihood estimator result we have is specialized for the IC model. And next, I can talk about the result, which can it's very general.
Tamer Bashar has the next question. Tamer, do you want to ask yourself?
Yeah, maybe Lei, you answered this in your responses to the earlier questions, but I was wondering how eccentricity changes with time for time varying topologies, especially if you are doing sort of an inverse identification in the inverse location of sources. By the time you get back, the source may not be there.
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, short answer, I don't know. That's a challenging problem. Yeah, I don't have an immediate answer to your question. How to deal with that time varying topology, right?
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for that, I haven't seen many work dealing with that problem. Like if the topology is time varying, and as you said, the snapshot we have is very different from the snapshot when the infection started from, then how to deal with this situation. It seems very, very challenging.
Essentially, it's a static topology, that static scenario that you are modeling and looking into.
Yeah, right. So the edges here is static. It's not dynamically changing. Yeah. Okay, any other question?
No, go ahead, Lei.
Okay, thanks, Rika. So yeah, so the main result on tree is the maximum likelihood estimator is the Jordan infection center. That holds, as I commented already, it holds for general tree and the heterogeneous IC model as well. Okay, so you'll probably notice, including the rumor center and this Jordan infection center, the theoretical result I talked so far only works for tree network. So how about for general network, right? At least more general than tree, right? So next, I'm gonna talk about how to use Jordan infection center on one particular random graph, Arbor random graph. I believe everyone knows. That's one of the first random graph models we usually start from. So to talk about that, let me just do a quick recap. So what makes the Jordan center so special on the tree? The Jordan center is so special on the tree is because these signature nodes, which I call signature nodes. So what are the signature nodes? Signature nodes are the nodes that are T hops away from the source. So again, the node in the middle is the source. So if we have 3 time slots for taking, we took the snapshot at time slot 3, then these 3 nodes are the nodes which are 3 hops away from the actual source. And why these nodes are so special is because from the actual source, we can reach these 3 signature nodes with t hops or 3 hops. But if you move away from the actual source, the one circled in blue, to any other node, let's say these nodes are circled in green, then it takes at least t plus 1 hops to reach all the signature nodes. Because these signature nodes are on different branches. So if you move from the center to different branch, then on the tree, you have to go through this root node to get to other signature nodes. So therefore, it increases the number of hops you have. So that's also why the Jordan infection center is a good estimator, because it minimizes the distance, kind of utilize this structure to reach. That's very efficient for reaching these signature nodes, right? So that's why on the tree network, the Jordan infection center works well. But now, if we have a general network, what will happen? The general network, we know we have many more other edges on the graph as well. For example, we can add an edge I just added on the slide. So that will provide a different path to reach the signature node with a small number of hops. If I add another one, right, then it provides another shortcut to another signature node. So with these additional edges added in the graph, the node circled in green does not have to go through the root node, the node circled in blue, to reach all the signature nodes. So because of that, these additional edges are called multi-path edges, provide multiple paths from one node to another, actually can generate multiple Jordan centers or Jordan infection center. And even worse, it can generate a Jordan infection center which actually has a smaller infection eccentricity than the source node. So that leads to the mistakes of using the Jordan infection center, right? So that's the main issue. But still, we want to understand if we are insisted on using the Jordan infection center, then on our general graph, how many of these multi-path edges the graph will have? And what's the impact of each of these multi-path edges? Can we still say something about the Jordan infection center? Okay, so again, we have to restrict ourselves to a specific model if we want to say something theoretically. So here I restrict ourselves to a Dawkins random graph, probably the most simple random graph we can have. So the network will have n nodes, and each pair will be connected with probability p. The p we chosen to be log n over n, so that the network is connected with probability 1. Okay, so you have the example, you have a bunch of nodes, and you pick 2 nodes and connect that with probability p, and that's how you form the graph. Again, we're going to look at IC model with probability q, but I just want to mention this result actually work for SIR model, which you allow recover continuous infection. Continuous infection means you can infect your neighbor over multiple time slots, not just one. And also it holds for partial observation. You don't have to get a complete snapshot. You just need to sample the nodes with certain probability uniform. Okay. So for that, I think that's one of the results, as I mentioned. The problem is very easily defined, but takes 30 pages double column to prove the result. So let me just present you the result first. So what we identified is a possibility and impossibility result. So it turns out there's a diffusion time t. The diffusion time, well, what I meant is the time you took the snapshot. Okay. So we define this diffusion time t star to be log n over log n. Okay. And our result says if the time you take the snapshot is larger than t star or equal to t star, then no algorithm can detect the source with a non-zero probability as network size goes to infinity. On the other hand, if the time you took the snapshot is equal or smaller than 2/3 of t star, then you can detect the source with probability 1 with Jordan infection center as network size goes to infinity. So we have perfect detection if the time you took a snapshot is more or equal to 2/3 of t star, and no algorithm can detect the source if the diffusion time is larger than t star. And in between is still an open question. I don't know the answer for that. Okay. Is this clear? Maybe I can also pause for a minute to answer any question about these statements. Okay. If not, let's first look at the impossibility result. The impossibility result actually is quite straightforward to show. What it says is if the diffusion time is larger than t star, then the entire network will become infected with high probability. So now if the snapshot you have is the entire network is infected and you don't have any other information, then each node is equally likely to be the source node, right? So as network size goes to infinity, that accuracy goes to 0. Okay. The way to show that is you combine the diffusion process with the process of generating the ER graph. So you're basically generating effective live edge ER graph. Then you can show the diameter of that is log n over log n. That's why if the diffusion time is log n over log n, the entire network will be infected with high probability, or probability 1 as n goes to infinity. Okay. So that's pretty straightforward and also pretty intuitive. The most interesting result is about the perfect detection. For the perfect detection, it can also be divided into 2 regimes. One regime is the infection time, or the diffusion time is smaller than 1/3 of t star. Okay. In this case, actually, you can show the network is basically a tree. Okay. So that's utilize the structure. The ER random graph has this local tree structure, which has been utilized in many analysis. So if the diffusion time is more than 1/3 of t star, you basically again have a tree if you look at your infection subnetwork. So in that case, again, the result I talk about for tree will hold there. That's why the Jordan infection center is still most likely to be the source. Okay, and the most interesting result is this regime 2, where you actually are generating many edges in the graph, which I mean, in additional to the edges make it a tree. So the graph is not at all like a tree. You have many triangles, circles, and so on, many loops. But we can still see the Jordan infection center is a source with high probability, or probability 1. Okay. So to show you how to get this result, again, I would like to come back to these 2 questions. One is how many multi-pass edge we can have, okay, in an ER random graph with a given diffusion time. And what's the impact of each individual multi-pass edge? Like basically how many shortcut it can provide to cover those signature nodes to generate additional Jordan infection centers, right? So these are 2. So for doing that, let me again just very briefly mention the key ideas. First, what we do is we construct this breadth-first search tree starting from the actual source. Okay, so let's say the Genie tells you which node is the actual source, so you can create this breadth-first tree, okay, from the ER random graph. And these nodes at the bottom, like in blue color, are also infected nodes, but these are the signature nodes I talk about. These are the nodes if the diffusion time t. These are the ones which are t hop away from the source. So we have other, let's say, other leaf nodes as well, but like the leaf nodes on the left is not the signature nodes because it's 3 hops away, and all the signature nodes are 4 hops away. So these are subset of leaf nodes, but they are different from the leaf nodes. These are the nodes you can think the furthest away from the root node. Okay, so now let's say somehow we in our network, by adding this additional edge, multi-pass edge in the way of generating ER graph, we are able to create another Jordan center. So let's see when it will happen, right? So let's look at this node circled in green. Let's see when we will make this node also a Jordan center. So to make this node a Jordan center, we need to make sure this node can reach those signature nodes while other paths, other than the one which goes through the root node. Because if we need to go through the root node, then what will happen is is then you have to go to the root. Then from the root node to reach these secondary nodes, you will take another t hops. So the distance will be larger than directly starting from the source or the root. Okay, so therefore we need to add this additional multipass edge to be able to create those shortcuts. Okay, so a couple of observations. First is if this shortcut edge is closer to the root node, which means it's on the top level of the tree, then potentially it can provide shortcuts to many of these signature nodes. On the other hand, if the multipass edge is closer to the bottom of the tree, to the leaf node, then it can only cover a small number of them because the leaf node on the, or signature nodes on that branch become smaller compared to the case if the multipass edge is closer to the source. So basically we are dealing two things. One is as we go down the tree, you will see later we have more and more and more on these multipass edges, but each multipass edge will cover less number of these signature nodes. We will call signature nodes can be reachable through this multipass edge to be covered. So as you go down the tree, then you have more these multipass edges, but for each of them, it can cover less number of these signature nodes. Okay, so basically we just need to look at whether it's possible to include all the signature nodes in the breadth tree such that we can generate another Jordan infection center. Okay. So again, I'll skip the detail. The analysis is complex because you have all these correlations between different levels. Okay. But the one thing we able to leverage is you can see, just look at it from mean calculation perspective, replace everything just with the average value, right? So you can see the nodes on each level will start to increase, right? Probably exponentially increase. And if you look at the multipass edge, this multipass edge has a special property given we have this breadth tree. The multipass edge can only exist among nodes at the same level or the nodes at neighboring levels. Okay. The reason is if we have a multipass edge on this, let me see, on this breadth tree which cross, let's say, 2 different levels, that violate this tree is a breadth tree because this node should be moved to upper level. Okay. So therefore, on this breadth tree, if we look at multipass edges, the multipass edge can only exist among nodes at the same level or the nodes at neighboring level. So now if we can characterize, use the concentration result about with high probability how many nodes we have at each level, we can then calculate how many multipass edge we can have at each level associated with each level. And then from that, we can look at what the signature nodes will be associated with this multipass edge to calculate that as well. Okay. So this following table basically is a quick summary. I mean, these are not accurate numbers, just some mean calculation. You can see as the number of level increase, initially you have no multipass edge at the beginning until it reach a level t star divided by 2. That's why it's a local tree until level t star divided by 2. Then after that, the number of multipass edge will be roughly at this order. And for each edge, it can cover roughly this number of signature nodes. So if you count this total number of signature nodes, which can be covered by the multipass edges, then it at the order of this first one here. And if you look at the signature nodes on the breadth tree, this is at the order of n times p times q raised to the power of t. So then it's not very difficult to verify if the diffusion time is less than 230 t star, then the Jordan infection center, the source node is still the unique Jordan infection center in the graph. So therefore, if you find the Jordan infection center, this has to be the source with probability 1 asymptotically. Okay. So just a quick recap of this result on Erdős-Cheney random graph. We know result in 2 of the 3 regimes. We know if it's smaller than 230 t star, we have perfect detection asymptotically. If we go beyond t star, then we have no chance of finding the source asymptotically. And in between, it's become very interesting. So we don't have anything theoretical to say, but we do have an interesting algorithm, which it turns out to work well in this case. So the algorithm is in the regime between two-thirds of T star and the T star. It turns out, even you look at the empirically simulation, there's many Jordan centers. Okay, so the question now is how to break tie if we have many Jordan infection centers. It turns out a nice way to break tie is to look at these signature nodes, or the nodes at the last level, the first way from the given source. The more number of nodes, it turns out that better, I mean, more likely that one to be a source. I mean, it's again, the heuristic, it's not a proof. So therefore we have this so-called short fat tree algorithm. The algorithm does is for every node, we construct a breadth tree. We first find the shortest trees, which means these root nodes are Jordan infection centers. Then among the shortest node, we find the nodes with the largest, lowest level, so we call the fat tree. So basically the root node associated with the shortest and fattest tree turns out to be a very good source estimator. And there's lots of simulation results based on different topology, different diffusion models you can find in our paper. Okay, so before I pause and take questions, I just want to mention, turns out the Jordan Infection Center is also a good estimator from another perspective. So in our 2012 paper, we developed a concept called a sample path-based estimator. So instead of look at the maximum likelihood estimator, we ask the question, if a given node, we find the most likely path, then we use the node which associated with the diffusion sequence with the highest probability as the source node, then what happened? So again, maybe I didn't say it clearly. So given our observation, again, this is for tree. So given a tree network, given the observation, there's many different ways can lead to the observation, right? So each particular infection sequence can be sorted as a tree. So we have many different infection trees. And each of these trees associated with different probabilities. So instead of looking at the maximum likelihood estimator, let's find the root node of the most likely tree and use that as our estimator. Okay, just different ways to use the estimator. It turns out the Jordan Infection Center is remarkably robust estimator in that sense. It has been shown this is a simple path-based estimator for SI model, SIS model, SIR model, and SIRI model in this paper. It's called On the Universality of Jordan Center for Estimating Infection Source. It's a very nice paper. I'll suggest you to read if you're interested in this topic as well. Okay, so other than the maximum likelihood and perfect detection on ER graph, it's also a very strong estimator on the general diffusion models and the general trees as well. Okay, so I guess I'll skip the next topic given the time. I'll comment on like what are the open problems we can have. These are interesting open problems, but before that, I would like to pause and to see whether there's any question about that. Okay, and after answering question, this will be my last slide.
Srikanth, can I go ahead and ask?
Sure.
Yeah, it's actually more an observation. I found the result quite interesting. And you might want to look at this interesting work by R. Ravi, where they look at broadcasting algorithms in graphs. And they tried, it turns out the broadcasting is related to finding a balance between the diameter and the degree of the tree. And it's roughly what you seem to get in this big, fat trees and shallow trees. And so,
okay, very interesting. Would you mind?
Yeah, I will send it to you, but it seems very related in certain sense. So once I look at the proof, I'll have a better sense. But you might want to take a look.
Of course. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So Tamer, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I was wondering whether if you have some nested topology approach. By that I mean you first locate a group of nodes where the source is, and then you go in and concentrate on that group of nodes and do your maybe to a subgroup of that, and then go from subgroup to individual nodes. Would that speed up the process of locating the source?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think especially given more realistic topologies, that would be an excellent method to do that. For example, if the diffusion is not just purely graph-based, maybe spatial graphs, then like this multi-resolution type approach you mentioned, like first go maybe at the larger region level, then focus on a single region to do maybe more final location level, that I think will be excellent algorithm.
And that would also be a way to do it possibly if you have multiple sources.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
may be in distinct separated groups.
Right.
So therefore you identify the groups and then do in parallel, in fact, location for each source in the group.
Yeah, exactly. And also this relates to another, I think, open problem I want to mention is here what we assume is all observations are given to us. Another way, or another very interesting problem is to do active sampling, right? So you don't have many information at the beginning, but you can like do the testing, like in the COVID-19 case, to figure out what happened. So now you have limited of maybe testing resource, and you try to use that either to locate a source or reconstruct how the diffusion has occurred over the last week, last months. Then I think what you said is make perfect sense. Maybe you want to do like first region-based detection, like active sampling, to see which region is more likely to be the breakout region first, then maybe zoom in and to allocate more sampling testing resource towards that as well. Yeah. So I think that also can be used in that context as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess in the interest of time, Lei, maybe you can summarize in a minute or two so we can give people a break before they've overrun stock.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so just want to mention, although there's a lot of work, lots of papers out there, and then collectively we have made lots of progress, but still there are many interesting problems out there. For example, I divide that into 3 different directions. One is we now mainly look at the contact-based diffusion model, either IC model, SR model, SRI model, they are all contact-based. But if you look at like opinion dynamics and looking at information, mainly diffusion is based on strategic behaviors, not contact-based, right? It's made like linear threshold model and other model. They are not purely contact-based model. So how to locate a source in those general opinion dynamic diffusion case is a very good question, I think, worth looking into. And another is even the ER graph is more general than the tree. It's not the most realistic network. We have like power law network, random dot product graph, spatial network. And there are many general graphs out there. Maybe we can use the approach Tamir mentioned. So some of the graphs actually are created in a hierarchical way. So you first have ER graph, you connect ER graph with each other and so on to formulate larger graphs. So whether this multiple step detection can help there in those graphs, that'll be interesting to look at too. And also with incomplete information, I think I mentioned, I think one interesting problem is to do active sampling, right? So here all the observations are given to us, but now you have a fixed budget of resource. You can look at nodes, maybe know what time they're infected or like who infect who for a small subset, and to how to allocate this resource to improve the source localization accuracy. I think also a fantastic problem for those who are interested. Okay, so with that, I guess I conclude my tutorial, and thanks everyone, and thanks for all the interesting, excellent questions.